My name is Monica Brown, and I teach 8th grade U.S. History and Social Studies at Key Middle School here in HISD. Today, I'm going to take you through a lesson where we're going to explore the Reformers movement, and then we'll look at those who contributed to the abolitionist movement. But before we get started, there are a couple of things that I would like for you to have today. You do need to have a pen or pencil to take some notes, and you do need to have paper to write on. And of course, if you would prefer to write in your journal, you can certainly do that. So let's take a look at our learning targets today and see what exactly we are learning. You will be able to describe the contributions of significant political, social, and military leaders of the United States, such as Frederick Douglass, John Paul Jones, James Monroe, Stonewall Jackson, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You are also going to be able to describe and evaluate the historical development of the women's movement and the abolitionist movement in the United States. So let's take a look at some of the vocabulary that you will hear today. The first word is reformers. A reformer is a person who makes changes to something in order to improve it. Temperance or temperance movement. Temperance refers to the abstinence of alcohol or drinking alcohol. Abolition or abolition movement. Abolition is the action or the act of abolishing a system, practice, or institution. In this case, we are talking about the abolition of slavery in the United States. And then the last word is suffrage. Suffrage means that it is the right to vote in political elections. Let's make a real life connection as we begin to talk about the reformers movement. You know, there are many social issues within the United States that citizens are concerned with. Here's a list of some issues that I'm going to show you. In your opinion, which issue is the biggest concern in the United States? Let's take a look at our choices, and then I want you to choose one that you feel strongly about. When you have decided, you can complete the following sentence stem. Blank is the biggest concern because. So which issue is the biggest concern in U.S. society and why? Well, we have public education, alcohol abuse, equal rights for women, care for the mentally ill, rights for workers, and care for the disabled. Which one of these is a bigger concern to you? Perhaps it's something that affects you and your family personally, and so maybe it's a bigger concern, something that's on your mind more than the other ones. Maybe you're concerned about public education and the direction it's going. Or maybe you're concerned about alcohol abuse and the effects that it has on others. What about equal rights for women? The right to be able to make the same amount as anyone else, or the right to have access to work and to do the same thing that anyone else does, or care for the mentally ill, making sure that anyone has the option to have the best care no matter who they are. What about rights for workers? We hear a lot about the rise in the minimum wage. There's a lot of talk about that. So what about rights for workers? And then finally, maybe care for the disabled is more important to you. As you consider these, I want you to use the sentence stem. Blank is the biggest concern because, so fill in the blank for which one is most important, and then decide why it is a big concern for you. Many social issues that people are fighting to correct or improve in the United States today, these were also issues that we dealt with in the 1800s. In the 19th century, people began to lead and join reform movements to improve society. So let's take a look at the reform movements of the 19th century. The Second Great Awakening. Let's start there. You may remember that the first Great Awakening that we talked about was during the colonial era. The First Great Awakening was a religious revival, and people began to think that a king should not have absolute power. This helped cause the American Revolution. Do you remember that? When we talked about the First Great Awakening right before the American Revolution? Well, now we are at the Second Great Awakening, and people are beginning to change and think how they feel. It's important because it inspired people to join reform movements to fix social problems. One of those problems was how women were treated in society at that time. As the Second Great Awakening spurred religious revivals throughout the US, many people began to work to change or reform society. During the first half of the 19th century, American reformers devoted themselves to causes such as promoting the rights of women and other minorities and improving education. So let's take a look at this first part of the women's movement. And we'll start here at the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments. One of the main reform movements of the 1800s focused on women's rights. Women in the 19th century were not guaranteed or granted many of the same rights as men, including the right to vote or sit on public juries and hold public office. To gain equal rights, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and other reformers organized the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848. This convention posed the Declaration of Sentiments, a document that called on men to not withhold a woman's rights. The Declaration of Sentiments launched the movement to change women's roles in American life. The focus of the women's rights movement turned to securing suffrage, or the right to vote. The movement eventually led to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote in 1920. The temperance movement was another reform movement where women led the way. The goal of this movement was to lessen the use of alcohol. Many men under the influence of alcohol would abuse their wives and children or abandon their families altogether. Groups such as the Christian Women's Temperance Union and the Daughters of Temperance fought to ban alcohol within the United States. The temperance movement finally gained the victory it sought with the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919. This amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol within the United States. The amendment was later repealed in 1933. Fair treatment of factory workers was also an issue in the 1800s. As the factory system developed in the North, working conditions worsened. Employees, including children, worked as much as 6 days a week and 12 hours or more a day, often in harsh conditions. The National Trades Union was formed in 1834 by Eli Moore and John Comerford. The purpose of this union was for workers to join together to strike or stop working and demand fair treatment. Unfortunately, this great union fell apart with the Panic of 1837. However, it established that unions and strikes had high potential to be influential in protecting workers' rights in the future. So now let's look at someone who really was a big part of the reformers movement. Dorothea Dix. Dorothea was in her early 30s when she traveled to England. While in England, she learned about the plight of the mentally ill. She discovered how mentally ill patients were often treated like criminals or worse. They were put in cages, beaten, chained, and tied up. Dorothea felt like she had found her calling in life. She wanted to help the mentally ill. Dorothea returned to the United States on a mission to make life better for the mentally ill. She started off by doing her own investigation into the treatment of the mentally ill in Massachusetts. She took detailed notes and described all she saw. When she prepared her report to the state legislature, her hard work paid off when a bill was passed to improve and expand the mental hospital in Worcester. Working off her initial success, Dorothea began to travel the country, lobbying for the improved care of the mentally ill. She went to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Illinois, and Louisiana. Legislation was passed in many of these states to improve and build mental hospitals. That was Dorothea Dix. Now let's look at Horace Mann. Public education, well, that was a big social issue in the early 1800s. Horace Mann, often called the father of the common school, began his career as a lawyer, a legislator, and later a member of Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837. He began the common school movement, ensuring that every child would receive a basic education funded by local taxes. His influence soon spread beyond Massachusetts as more states took up the idea of universal schooling. Mann believed that public schooling was central to good citizenship and societal well-being. Mann was influential in the development of teacher training schools, the improvement of the quality of education offered in rural schools, and the recruitment of women into the ranks of teachers. That was Horace Mann. And now let's look at the development of the abolition movement. There are several people that I'm going to introduce you to today. And the first one is Levi Coffin. Levi Coffin, well, he and his wife Catherine were important abolitionists. His wife and he were Quakers. As a Quaker, he says, "We are opposed to slavery. We believe that all people are created equal in the eyes of God. If we believe this, then we could not support slavery. We supported the abolition movement by helping slaves escape to freedom in the North on the Underground Railroad. Some people even call me the president of the Underground Railroad. Life for a runaway slave was full of hazards. Often, escaped slaves would hide in homes or on the property of anti-slavery supporters. Our home was one of the stops on the journey. During the 20 years we lived in Newport, Indiana, we helped more than 2,000 slaves reach safety." Frederick Douglass. My name is Frederick Douglass, and I was a leader of the abolition movement in the decades prior to the Civil War. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland and eventually escaped to the North. As a former slave, he experienced the horrors of slavery firsthand. And he says that he believed that if there is no struggle, there is no progress. I supported the abolition movement by giving anti-slavery speeches to the public and founding an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. I wanted my newspaper to promote freedom for all slaves. I also wrote these autobiographies later in life. I served as an advisor to President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Now let's look at William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, he believed that slavery was unjust and the immediate emancipation or freeing of slaves was the right way to end slavery, once and for all. Sometimes people say that he was the most disliked abolitionist of them all, but he said that didn't bother me. He says, I felt very strongly about ending slavery, and I let people know that I will be heard. In 1831, I began publishing the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. I believed that the issue of slavery was incredibly important and attention needed to be brought to this horrible institution. Now let's look at Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist and an author. She was born in Connecticut and raised in a very religious home. After hearing about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, she became upset and wrote a fictional novel describing the evils of slavery. In 1852, her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was published. The story depicted the harsh life for African Americans under slavery. It became an instant bestseller in the North, but was banned in most parts of the South. Plays based on the book were performed in many towns in the North and helped convince many Northerners that slavery should be abolished. As a result of her book, abolitionist support grew in the North. However, it angered the South. Now let's look at Nat Turner. Nat Turner was an African American slave. He lived his entire life in Southampton County, Virginia. He worked on several plantations in his life and saw firsthand the horrors of slavery. After receiving what he believed to be a sign from God, he says, I took matters into my own hands. While other abolitionists used words to try to end slavery, I used force, he says. In 1831, he led a revolt to slaves in Virginia. He says, I recruited several fellow slaves to support my cause. During the revolt, about 60 whites were killed by me and my followers. After the rebellion, I was hanged along with 16 other rebels. So now let's look at the impacts of the abolitionist movement. What was the goal of the abolitionist movement? Well, the goal of the abolitionist movement was emancipation or freeing of all slaves and the end of racial discrimination and segregation. This movement of the 19th century had many impacts, both positive and negative, for life in the United States. For abolitionists fought to end slavery, many people began to become aware of the movement. As a result, more and more people started to realize that slavery was immoral. Support grew for the movement. Many abolitionist societies were formed to support the cause. In some cases, African American abolitionists, such as Harriet Tubman, led these societies. The first African American newspaper, Freedom's Journal, was founded in 1827. This was the same year New York abolished slavery. The movement also impacted education, and in 1835, Oberlin College began accepting African American students. However, as the support of the abolitionist movement grew, so did the opposition. For instance, people in the South that passed out abolitionist literature, such as newspapers, were often harassed. Sometimes mailbags containing the same literature were even burned. Virginia mobs tore through cities such as New York, protesting the abolition of slavery. These rioters burned churches, businesses, and homes, many of them belonging to African Americans. In Congress, a gag rule was passed as a response to anti-slavery petitions. This prohibited the discussion of petitions relating to slavery in Congress. The abolitionist movement also led to the increased divide between the North and South. This is called sectionalism. And this division between the Northern and Southern United States, it was about to be a very big problem. So let's look at some positive impacts and some negative impacts of the abolitionist movement. Some positive impacts were that more people believed and began to realize that slavery was immoral, and the support begins to grow. Abolitionist societies are formed. The first African American newspaper is printed. New York abolished slavery in 1827, and then Oberlin College begins to admit African American students. Let's look at some of the negative impacts. Abolitionists were harassed. Their literature was burned. Violent mobs began to emerge. There was a gag rule in Congress where you couldn't even talk about the issue. And then there was this increase in this idea of sectionalism. So let's debrief here for a minute and let's look at what was the most important impact of the abolitionist movement. Well, we have sectionalism, and then we have the North versus the South. This is going to be a very big problem coming. What do you think will happen as a result of this growing sectionalism in the United States? The Civil War. It's coming, and we'll probably pick up on that in our next lesson. So now let's look at your primary source assignment. I want you to follow along with me as I read through this paragraph. This is an actual quote from Angelina Grimke from a speech at Pennsylvania Hall in 1838. Okay, you're going to be asked a series of questions and you're going to go through them, and then I've provided a sentence stem for you at the bottom. So follow along as I read. As a Southerner, I feel that it is my duty to stand up here tonight and bear testimony against slavery. I have seen it. I have seen it. I know it has horrors that can never be described. I was brought up under its wing. I witnessed for many years its demoralizing influences and its destructiveness to human happiness. It is admitted by some that the slave is not happy under the worst forms of slavery, but I have never seen a happy slave. I have seen him dance in his chains, it is true, but he is not happy. Angelina Grimke, speech at Pennsylvania Hall of 1838. So I'm going to give you maybe just about a minute, and I want you to answer these questions, just kind of go through them. Who is the speaker? Where is the speech given? Does Grimke support the abolitionist movement? Yes or no? And how do you know? Okay, you can cite your evidence. So here's a sentence stem for you to start with. Angelina Grimke did or did not support the abolitionists because, and if you can fill in that blank for me. You have about 1 minute to do that. Okay, now let's take a look at another primary source. This time, this is a speech to Senate in 1837 by the South Carolina Senator John Calhoun. John Calhoun says, "We of the South will not, cannot surrender our institutions. I hold slavery to be a good, as it has thus far proved itself to be both and will continue to prove so if not disturbed by the full spirit of abolition. I appeal to facts. Never before has the Black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically, but morally and intellectually." That was John Calhoun in 1837. So we know that the speaker is John Calhoun. And where is the speech given? We'll do this one together. The speech was given to Senate. Did John Calhoun support the abolitionist movement? I think it's safe to say no, he did not support the abolitionist movement. And how do you know? Well, I mean, look here. He says in his speech that we of the South will not, cannot surrender our institutions. He thinks that slavery is good, that somehow the people who were brought here from Central Africa are living a better life, that their condition is improved, that they live in civilization, that they have been improved morally and intellectually. So not only did he not support the abolitionist movement, he was a full supporter of slavery. Okay, we know this because of the speech he gave. So John Calhoun did not support the abolition movement because I think we just answered that. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for this lesson. This was probably one of the most exciting lessons, and it is just on the cusp of something really big that's about to happen. And we'll discover that in our following lessons. I'm Monica Brown. I teach 8th grade U.S. History and Social Studies at Key Middle School. Thank you.